Hi, everybody. Um, Welcome to the urbanization debate of day 2 of the WSA festival. Today, here joining us is Dr. Rutul Joshi. He has played a big role as a person of color and of Indian ethnicity to the University of CEPT, and he will be joining us and telling us more about the urbanization process and where the ethics lie, where in the population lies, and certain aspects of it that we might have not known from his background and his expertise. Dr. Rutul Joshi is an associate professor at the Faculty of Planning and the head of doctoral office at CEPT University. He chairs the foundation semester for all postgraduate programs in the Faculty of Planning and leads the first semester foundation studio Understanding the City. Apart from the studio, he teaches urban history at the undergraduate and postgraduate level and urban theories at the PhD program. His research interests in transit-oriented development, sustainable mobility, and approaches to reform urban planning practices. His current research focuses on post-COVID mobility challenges, parking policies, TOD-based retrofit for low-income countries. He also occasionally writes in newspapers and media on urban mobility and civil issues. Mr. Rutul, would you like to answer this question?
Right. So we can surely discuss the sustainability of urbanization, but I think it's also important to know who's asking this question and sustainability for whom. I think I go back to, there is one essay by Ivan Illich who wrote in 1970s called Energy and Equity. So moment we start talking about sustainability, we also have to look at the equity aspect as well. And he recognizes that when you have energy consumption, it does lead to a certain level of social progress. So people who have already achieved that progress, they can definitely say that, yes, probably we have to look at our consumption and our prospects, because we are already a prosperous society. People who have not been prosperous, the only option for them, the options they have, which might be very, very different. So I think we have to contextualize sustainability as well.
If you could give it a context of Europe or even of Asia, would you be able to give us a bit of a definitive answer on how you would talk about urbanization in sustainability? So for example, India as a context, and you've researched it, what would you be able to comment on that aspect of urbanization and sustainability in correlation to each other?
No, absolutely. So in India, I think it would not be really fair to ask us question as to whether or not we want to urbanize, because we are urbanizing at a pretty fast pace. The question would be, how do we manage urbanization better? So that our cities still remain livable and sustainable and equitable. So, and also we have to understand that in India, the kind of urbanization we have is if there are people who are going to come from villages where they are under extreme poverty, and when they are joining as a migrant laborer in cities, they are actually making their lives better. And I don't think it would be ethical to say that, well, you should not be coming to the cities, right? And what we need to really do is to prepare cities so that we have, better public systems, better shared system. The way in which I look at urbanization and urban planning is that it is more about strengthening the public system. And when I say public, I don't mean public or private sector. What I mean is collective or shared system. So if you are a migrant laborer coming to the city, you should have decent, affordable housing. You should have decent, affordable transport. And you should be able to make your ends meet and educate your children and the future generation, right? So in the context of many developing countries. I'm also working in some of the Eastern African cities, and there we see a similar kind of trend that a lot of people are leaving villages behind and joining the industrial or the service workforce in the city. Now, the question is, how well do we manage that? How do we strengthen our public system of service land delivery, of public transport, of public housing, or at least shared housing, which is at the affordable rate? That is really the question. I don't think that if you are a landless laborer somewhere in hinterland in India, and if somebody tells you that, well, you can't go to the city because it's full right now, sorry, I don't think it will be fair.
So how could we urbanize in a way that would create a healthy society? So how do you kind of control that through the physical aspects of urban design?
Right. So that's I
complex. Sorry.
answer to that. But I would say, like I said, see, the way in which I look at the role of urban development and urban planning is you have to strengthen your collective or shared systems. You have to let me go back to the fundamental idea of the city. And it says that, see, if I can make a city where if I'm going to have a garden to myself, I'm going to make a spread out sprawling cities. And there are many cities like that where they said that I'm going to have a garden and a swimming pool and a place to park 4 cars, right? And might be individual benefits of that kind, but as a city, in my view, of course, they are horrible cities if they end up providing this to individuals. So what you have in a good city is to say that, well, I have shared transport. I don't need to have a garden to myself, but I will have shared public open spaces. I don't need to have a swimming pool to myself, but I will share it as a public facility, so and so forth. I will not throw garbage out of the window. I will have a shared system to come take and collect it. And when you put this, then you can actually effectively make people live in a compact urban form, in a sort of slightly denser locality, but with better standard of living. And that's what really is the struggle in many of the developing countries, right? And what we really need to do is to say that, well, we need to invest in our public transport. Now, many of the developing countries 20 years back, 30 years back, were in a situation where they simply did not have money to build infrastructure. Now they have money. So we have a different level of problem. So to sort of answer you very, very briefly, our problem right now is what is the appropriate infrastructure? Do we invest in making a sort of number of flyovers, or do we really invest in public transport system? And that's really the ongoing struggle. Do we make centralized top-down systems, or do we make systems which really empower people?
I actually completely agree, but I don't know how you get over that kind of hurdle of politics when you're trying to kind of create this kind of urbanization with shared spaces and shared resource for kind of community. How would you overcome that? I'm not sure how I know here in like London, for instance, where I am, there's, areas like Kensington, which have lots of shared private gardens. And then elsewhere, you've got larger shared spaces. But what this means is that there are no shared public spaces really in those neighborhoods for, the people who might be living in high-rise buildings, because all of the green space is owned privately by people. So how do you kind of overcome that personal preference and kind of, in a way, selfishness of people and certain political ideologies? Don't know if you can really.
Right. I mean, as a sort of fear of sounding a generalist, let me answer that question, that we have to work at all 3 or 4 avenues that we have. One is that, of course, politics. I would like that more and more young people join politics and fight for every square inch of public space that we have. Second is going to the judiciary. And here in India, we had an interesting case where, places where all the judges live, they had gated that community and converted a public road into a private road. And somebody filed a public interest litigation saying that, well, can you please open the road, please? We also, so judicial way is a way. It has its own limitation, but it's an interesting way. Politics is another way, and third is through our technical field, which is of urban planning and urban design and architecture, is to show them that there could be a better way of managing space. I think what I meant to say that now we are in a situation where we have money and we are spending and building infrastructure in many developing countries. I think it's a question of how do you make more appropriate infrastructure? How do you, and you also have to educate people in terms of spatial and visual knowledge. Unless you reorganize the space many times and show it to people that, well, it could be used this way, it could benefit everybody, people are not ready to believe. Until that point in time, they are only trying to save their own corner, right? So I see urban planning, urban design, architecture as a huge role to play in that visual communication and in spatial solution to many problems. For the problems which you don't have spatial solutions, we have to go to the court. So actually, in India and elsewhere, also in African cities, many of the academicians and activists and advocates, they end up being part of some panel of the courts and advise them that, well, the kind of parking policy that you're making does not make sense. So can you please relook at it? So it's a process in any democratic society. Take the judicial engagement seriously, take the political engagement very, very seriously. And in many of the developing countries, you will see that the politics is becoming more and more urban. And that's a very good thing.
Would you be able to comment on the urbanization architectural factor that you said that there are solutions in architecture? So would you be able to comment on that and elaborate, as most of our students here would love to hear about architecture as well?
Right. So I think the way in which architecture is practiced in many of the developing countries, and I think elsewhere also, is that it becomes architecture which only intervenes in the private realm, right? So you're essentially 1% of your population owns properties, and maybe 0.1% would own land, and you keep designing things for them. Rather, I see there is a lot of scope for providing spatial solution for public problems. So how do you design a decent public housing, right? With limited budget and limited resources, and for the people who are not really used to live on higher floors, would like to spread out on the ground floor. I mean, that could be a real challenge. Secondly, I think someone was talking about a lot of private spaces, right? So maybe how do you carve out some of the public corners out of private spaces so that it becomes a negotiated solution? That, well, you retain your share, but we also have a little bit of a share, right? That's how the role of equity plays out. That maybe external facing roads where you can cut some corners for public sitting, whereas some people inside can retain their private gardens, so to say. So I think moment you work in public realm, it is all about providing negotiated solutions. When you work in a private realm, you have a certain level of exclusivity and certain level of a sort of high-handedness, if you like, to say that, well, let's do this. And if your client agrees and ready to pay for it, you can do it. But in public problems, you will have to you have people with different opinions, and you have to find equitable solution in this. The good design would be, in that case, one would be, sort of tax the winners and compensate the losers. So right now, somebody with a private garden is the winner. But if we can tax them a little bit and say that, well, give 20% of your land for a public edge or a public interface, and losers, which is public at large, get a little bit of space. I mean, that's how we have to start negotiating. We can't say that, well, convert that private garden into public. It's never going to happen. So I think all of us have to learn that art of negotiation when we are working in a public environment.
We have a question in the chat saying, what would you say about the unpredictable rapid population growth in cities and to control urban sprawls without segregation of the poor and the rich?
See, I think we also have to recognize that many of these processes we cannot really completely control them. And that's why an analogy I used to, I give to my students is an analogy is that, see, urbanization in many of our developing countries is like you're riding a big elephant or you're riding a dinosaur, if you like. Okay, you can only nudge the animal to go in a particular direction. You can't control the animal. Okay, so one is we have to start with the humility. It is not backseat driving that we are doing. We are riding on top of an elephant. Okay, so then you sort of understand that you can't do everything. Number one. Number two is it's good to let certain things happen in our cities, and don't over design to say that, well, here is a housing for the poor. Again, like I would say that it's a matter of negotiation, that let, in some cases, market forces find out that, okay, maybe there is the only thing that you can provide in this area is low income group housing. And we have to allow that to happen as well. We can't keep forcing their hand all the time. So the way in which I would really think about this is to create better conditions so that more and more developers, small time contractors who are already there in the market prefer to make smaller apartments for low income group people in the city. That would be a good beginning. And lastly, I think what we need to do is, in many of the developing countries, we have to really work with informal settlements and provide temporary solutions for 10 years, 20 years, that, okay, if you are staying here for 20 years, how can we make a better design so that your life is better for 20 years? It's not permanent. Nobody will allow you to make a permanent shelter because the land is under dispute. So where are those kind of design solutions where we'll have to say that, well, it is possible that you might not be able to take a fire hydrant inside a slum, but can we still make a better house with temporary material, right? So I think we have to combine our technical knowledge with some pragmatism and say that, well, everything is not going to be possible, but at least can we do this? So I think that ways we'll have to make ways by which people who are being exploited in the rural area come to decent living, decent working condition in the cities. That is important. I mean, in that sense, I really like the idea of right to the city, that you have a right to come to the city and prosper yourself and your future generation. Give them access to education.
There's a question in the chat, in the Q&A box, if you could look and answer it as well. Urbanization often means fitting denser populations into smaller pockets of spaces, and with emphasis on placed on multiple uses/purpose buildings. How do we design homes in a way that we don't feel restricted in our personal spaces and privacy? So I think for this as well, where I live in an apartment complex myself, where we live in societies where we have a pool, we have a common area, we have a common park. So I think in that sense, even I would like to comment on how this can be used. So in denser populated areas, such as where I live, we have certain societies where there are 8 to 9 stories, and we all have like 7 to 8 buildings, and we share a pool, we share a parking road, we share security. And this is cheaper in terms of living privately, and it's cheaper in terms of security, and because there are guards that are employed by the society itself, and there are ways you can communicate with your peers. There is a social aspect to it, and you have a certain sense of community, and you get all the amenities, and most of the areas are pretty decent sized living as well. And there are luxury and there are low end houses, but they all offer the same amenities at different price points and areas, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, so I think as long as we are not making gated communities and there are public thoroughfares which are passing through them and connecting various neighborhoods, it's a good idea. I would also say that we also have to critically look at the building bylaws in many of the developing countries. I think in modernist planning, there is an inherent contempt for semi-open spaces, right, which were really part of traditional architecture, whether you go to East Africa or in India, or even many places in Southeast Asia, wherever I've traveled, you will have this nice veranda, which is a Portuguese term, balconies, which are attached with the houses. And so even if you have a tiny apartment, having a semi-open space like that would give you a great relief. Those are gone away with the modern building bylaws. Okay, and that is something that probably we need to bring it back. And the only way in which we can bring it back is to have better design solution. And those areas become, so they because they are sort of semi-open and semi-public, they are the one who really activate your streets and make your streets safer. If you go to cities like Delhi and many other places, city become a sort of the public space in the city becomes surrounded by two compound walls, because everybody's creating their gated heaven, whether it is low income group or a middle income group. So the city is exactly the sort of negative, a sort of assemblage of negative places. Imagine if you have to break down the compound wall and at least bring them lower, and you have a lot of hanging balconies which are overlooking the street. Then we can go back to the world of Jane Jacob and say that, well, now you have eyes on the street, right? And the answer has something to do with the way in which we design our buildings and our modern building bylaws. So one is that you can also give indirect access of public street like that, which was really the traditional model. And second thing is that if we can have public thoroughfare going through many of these so-called gated communities, because in gated communities, I find, and this happens Africa, South Africa, India, everywhere, that, sometimes that whole idea of security is pretty much perceived rather than real. You're actually sanitizing your city from a particular kind of population rather than it being real security threat. So I think simultaneously we have to change the public culture in making buildings and housing which are more outward than inward.
So we have one that is asking us about how do we maintain the charm and heritage of these informal settlements? Does this support small-scale development format?
So there are many examples from developing countries. One from my own city in Ahmedabad, where what they've done with informal settlement is that they gave a sort of formal, not exactly legal guarantee to the people who live in that informal settlement. The guarantee was very simple, that we will not evict you for 20 years. Okay. And what they did in return is to tell them that we'll give you 7 services, which are water supply, sanitation, stormwater drainage, electricity, garbage collection, etc., etc. And every house will have an individual toilet and a water tap coming inside the house. Okay. It's a very small investment to make in an informal settlement. For a municipal corporation in India and elsewhere would have a very huge budget. I mean, you can actually service 10 settlements with a cost of 1 flyover that you're making. And having done these 2 things, one, they said we'll give you services, we'll integrate you with the rest of the city. And secondly, they said that we'll not evict you from here for 20 years. That encouraged people to start investing in their housing. And you see that the entire area got upgraded over a period of time through incremental housing, through people's own efforts. Not only that, I mean, there have been studies here which have been done by scholars from worldwide, which says that the public health improved, education improved, access of girl child to schools improved, because now they don't have to go and fetch water for the whole family from elsewhere. Right? I mean, some of these things sounds like a fairy tale, as I'm telling you. But, well, those things happen. And then what happened is we got a global best practice award in some fancy, sort of event. And we started dumping that whole idea of doing incremental housing and slum upgradation, and we started building public housing. Okay, so sometimes some of these awards are very dangerous, and we should not give them early enough. And now we started making concrete boxes. We forgot a practice which was bottom up, democratic. It was really involving people, and now we are making millions of houses with standard design, with bad design, anti-climatic design, etc. And that's really the problem when it comes to housing for the low income groups. So yeah, I mean, there are solutions available, and what we really need is better designers.
What would you suggest these designs would look like in the future, if you could comment on that as well?
I think there again, I would go back to that idea of taking the semi-open spaces very seriously, because people who come, you can only afford a particular kind of floor plate where you have a minimum standard of housing. But if you have more semi-open spaces where people can spill over, then it would be very interesting. What would also be interesting to see, along with architecture, a better designed public spaces, etc., is advocacy campaign. Because what happens, see, there is a very important transition which takes place when you are living in an informal settlement. Then you start living in formal housing. One, you have to pay your regular maintenance, right? You are in a very different kind of formal system, and you need to really prepare people to be part of that process and to own the collective. So that's why it's very important that sometimes the collective structure, community structure come in place and architecture follows, rather than you make architecture and then everybody thinks that, there's an article written in 1960s called Tragedy of Commons, which talks about precisely this, that whatever is collective or public, no one really wants to own it up. So sometimes you have to create a sense of ownership first and then back it up with architecture. Then it will really work wonders.
What about these master planet schemes being dreamt up by star architects? Are these feasible in the future? Utopian or dystopian? Should the future of urbanization be collective?
Well, see, I am big fan of ordinary things, ordinary housing, and unglamorous looking processes which are messy, which make decent homes, and which are not part of any big schemes. Okay, because big schemes, we have a history of that failure. We also have to understand that our profession is a profession where a sort of certain kind of grandstanding is imbibed into it, right? So it's part of the game, so to say. We always like to overclaim and grandstand and etc. So I mean, I'm old enough not to be impressed by it. In 20s, I would have been. And that's why it's very important that we have ordinary, commonsensical, pragmatic solutions of design which you can apply at multiple levels. And not one big scheme or one super duper housing or one big area where you are going to transform something. They don't really work. I mean, we have had a history of them in the subcontinent.
If you have any comments about the European area or the UK per se as well, would you like to comment on there as well? Because there are a few social housing that have been prevalent in the past and they seem to be working. Would you like to give your 2 cents?
So I was sort of fortunate to see some of the very interesting social housing projects in Vienna and Amsterdam. And because I did my PhD from Bristol, I've also seen the kind of social housing which has been designed in England. There are a couple of things which I learned from Vienna and from a couple of places in Amsterdam. So one thing is that those housing, public housing estates, they employed urban designers to actually go and talk to people, different social groups, and tell them that, okay, now if you really want to design public spaces for you, how would you help us design? those spaces, right? So, I mean, the teenage girls would think very differently from teenage boys. And so different social groups, different age groups, different ethnicities. The project was that each person creates their own corner, because many of those estates are built in a modernist style where you have a high tower with a lot of open space. And now suddenly that open space is broken down into everybody's corner. And when those corners are next to each other, they will start interacting with them. Okay. So that's something that they did as part of an architectural process. The other thing that they did as part of social process was to appoint what they call a process manager, okay, or a diversity manager. Because in Vienna, the kind of housing you have is somebody from Middle East and Africa and somebody from Eastern Europe. They're all living together. And they have a very different cultural sense and a sense of how they want to use public space, what do they think is theirs versus what is collective, etc., etc. So the job of this diversity manager or a process manager is to manage all these processes. Somebody wants to sleep in the afternoon and the children are making noise. How do you deal with this kind of a problem? And you have to bring these people on the common grounds for some common events. And once they know that, yes, we are all human beings, we have our own sort of idiosyncrasies, etc., etc. Once they start talking to each other, that's where the happy accidents take place, where they start understanding each other's point of view. And sometimes in the kind of world that we live in, you have to force these processes. And under the pretense of something else altogether, you might have to bring those people together. And that is something which I found very interesting in, I think, Vienna. That was similar thing they also did in Malmo in Sweden, where there was another very large public housing estate. I think that's a place from where the footballer Ibrahimovic comes from. He's a sort of brand ambassador of the kids there. And, so the process is where you involve people to create spaces together in one way or the other. And so when you're actually writing a contract for public housing, a job, so you don't need an estate manager. I mean, you of course need an estate manager who's managing your estate, but you need a social process manager or a diversity manager. That is a job. That's a job in the new world, which you need to hire. And it should become the part of the contract, and the maintenance should pay for it. So it's both architecture and social processes coming together, really.
Over many decades, cities, road have become overrun with private vehicles. How do you see urban planning adapting to these changes? How do you make the system fair to those that travel by foot in the city, whilst also allowing more spaces for people using motor transports? Do you see the increase of investment in public transport and cycle lanes infrastructure at the best solution for the most efficient and greenest way of traveling? I think this is right up your alley.
No, absolutely. That's like the sort of story of my life. Today morning, we were training government official in city of Bangalore. And this is exactly what we were telling them. That, how do you design better footpaths? How do you maintain them? How do you have a better parking management plan so that all the investment that you are making in transit benefits the people? So this is really an ongoing struggle. And at the root of this ongoing struggle is a sort of a modernist promise that, when you come to the city, if you buy a vehicle, if you buy a car, and in many cases in many of the cities in the subcontinent, even a motorized two-wheeler, you are supposed to feel a sense of freedom. And you are supposed to take over the city with high speed, right? And you sort of strive for this dream. And that's really a wrong dream to have. And then somebody tells you that, it doesn't work like that. Your road will be congested, and you will be creating more harm for other people than you'll be doing any good. And that is really a problem that we are feeling in many of the cities. In Delhi, they made a bus rapid transit where somebody filed a public interest litigation saying that, well, I am an employer, I employ 50 people, I drive a car, and how dare you slow me down to run your public transport faster, right? Somebody said that in a legal affidavit, which was struck down by the court, but they could not save the project, right? So when it comes to sharing space in the city, a lot of people feel very, very differently, and people think that who have powerful vehicles, who are the employers, they employ 50 people, they don't want to give space for their people whom they employ or their socioeconomic class. That's a real struggle. And then people feel that I can park my vehicle anywhere just because it's expensive. And some of these vehicles are so big nowadays in Indian market. We are getting these SUVs. Uh, they are as big as the housing standards specified by government of India for the low income group housing. They're 25 square meters. That much space they take to park a vehicle like that. So absolutely, that's really the struggle. And I think it's important that the change is taking place slowly. So like I said, we made the first generation of projects of bus rapid transit, didn't really work out. Now we are in the second stage of second generation project, where we are reviving the whole discussion of having more pedestrian friendly infrastructure. At least understand that when you are parking your car in a public space, you are privatizing it and you must pay for it. So it's a lot of this attitudinal shift which you will require. And it's the same story in Addis Ababa, Dar es Salaam, Delhi, Ahmedabad, Bangalore. You will find that it's a similar kind of struggle that we are having. That how do you educate people to understand that, well, you will not be thriving by asking for more and more space for your private vehicles. And that's why you must have to strengthen your public transport system in one way or the other. So yeah, it's a real struggle. And it's a political struggle, it's a technical struggle, it's both combined.
Would you be able to comment on a green solution that can take place? As you said, we have ways of making sure the pedestrians are at more value. But looking at the population of these developing countries and the way the roads are built, how do you think that the pedestrians will be given that importance? Because if you look outside, we can see that there is a massive population which believe that you owning a car and using a car would be something that is more important than having a green solution. Is there a way to change this mentality, or do you think this will be the end of our road of sustainability in the future?
Well, I think I'm an optimist in this. It's going to take a little more time, and for a simple reason is that we will not be able to sustain with a lot of vehicles in our cities. Right? We have already started seeing the signals of bad air quality, and simply there is no space. Right now, the ownership in many of the developing countries is much lower than the vehicle ownership in European countries. So if Europeans countries would have 500 vehicles for every 1,000 population, in many of the Indian cities or African cities, you will find that the number is not even 100 for 1,000 population. Right? And so many people are going to buy vehicles and they are not going to have space. And when you don't have space or when you have constraint, that's where you are forced to think of very different kind of solutions. So that thing is slowly coming in many of the cities. But I think we have to simultaneously find technical solution and sort of attitudinal solutions as well. And that's why I think sometimes the real the real thing that you can do is design a couple of good streets and show them an alternative, which is implemented in India or in developing countries. Because I think now when we take example from Barcelona and New York, people are not too excited about it. So if we say that, well, an Indian city has designed a decent street with effective pedestrian footpath, why don't we copy that? then people are willing to listen to it. So I think we need to create more and more benchmarks where it is possible to create this kind of streets in Indian scenario. And I think that's what we are trying to do as much as possible.
What role would AI play in the future of collective democratic urbanization? Instead of using AI to plan a whole city, how can it help us to adapt to new corners or buildings to the city and people, rather than just the environmental factors that programs like infrared investigate?
I think this is a very important question. And it's an important question not only because it's AI, but it's also about how do we look at technology. We have a history of getting excited with technology and then giving them overpowering space in our lives. So if you look at the modernist planning or modernist design of Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright, and all of them were very excited by cars being in our lives. And then we realized that that excitement is fine, but we'll have to decide how much would we allow them to overpower us. And the same goes with technology. So you can use technology to, to have like some fancy sensors which does things for you, open doors, etc., automate a lot of things which work in a city. At the same time, you could also use technology for better public engagement, better social engagement, make certain things reach out to the kids who do not have access to education. Okay, participate in a social process, make voting simpler for simpler things at the local area level. So my question really would be that are we using technology to achieve better social engagement, or are we using really technology to empower our citizens? Then yes, I'm all for it. But if you're using technology to say that, we have a command and control center in the city and we are watching you, it's not a great use of technology in my view.
Would you like to comment on the fact that there are apps and AIs that are designed to design cities, not to the full extent, but how would that help in our position that we are in? I think the question also really wants to focus on how would the future use AI as a collective to plan a whole city, but also help us do that rather than doing it as a whole, but just be a side, like a right-hand man type thing to this process.
Well, I mean, I can definitely see life becoming better and we being more productive with better tools. So I don't see we should be using it in any other way than how we are using SketchUp or AutoCAD or anything. They do a lot of work themselves, but then we use them in a particular way, and there is a great sense in that. So I think we have to use technology for our purpose. And don't take that as a final solution. I think we have to be sensible enough about that they are going to make us more efficient and more productive, for sure. But again, we have to understand that they are means. They are not an end in itself. The end in itself is how to make livable city for everyone, right? How do we give access to education to the kids who don't have any? Okay, how do we support single mother and a certain kind of distressed family in the difficult situation? How do we make public health access to more and more number of people? If in the city which is designed by AI is doing all that, then of course, yes, why not? But we have to understand that those are the ends. And whichever way we reach there, we have to reach there. Right? So I can see that, AI or any sort of, spatial modeling helping us a great deal for taking a lot of decisions. And we must use them. But we have to remember that that's not an end in itself.
As most developing countries design their cities around the principle of those of developed countries. Is this the most appropriate strategy since they are based on examples which are considered successful, or should there be a breakthrough in this methodology?
Right. So, see, again, there is no black and white answer to it. When you're working in a developing countries kind of environment, if you want to convince the policymaker, I will use any argument that works. If somebody is big fan of what happens in London, we said that, yeah, look at King's Cross Station, look at how beautiful transit-oriented development they've done, right? So we use that example when it suits us, and we use some other example from the country. And I told them that, see, if you want to, if somebody who's a big fan of traditional urbanism or historic city, we said that, see, we always had a system of mixed land use because we had a shop below and a house above. That's our traditional system. So to push the idea of TOD, we use various kind of arguments. Okay, we cannot obviously adapt or borrow or import an idea completely. But at the same time, I don't think that there is a great amount of difference between the East and the West as well. Right? We all want cities where you empower pedestrians, etc., right? So I would say that, well, import your ideas from anywhere and use whatever argument work, because we have to really work towards making policymakers see value in them. Okay. Having said that, obviously, we are not going to create a Central Park and Manhattan in the middle of an Indian city. So be sensible about that as well. That obviously we can't copy everything, but, well, if there is an interesting idea of a Highland Park in New York, we should borrow it. Why not? I think there's a very...
Would you be able to...
sorry, just to sort of add to that, there is a very interesting quote by Gandhiji, okay, which says that, well, I will keep... I can't exactly paraphrase it, but it means broadly as that, see, when I make my house, I will keep my doors and windows of my house open for the wind from outside to come inside. But at the same time, I will not allow my house to be swept away by an external typhoon. So I think that balance we need to talk about. So you be open to a lot of ideas, but then don't get stripped off by it.
Would you be able to give a specific example that has been borrowed from a developed country to a developing country, and how that has helped the developing country as well?
So, broadly, I would say that the whole idea of transit-oriented development, it comes from an American context, because they have low density, sprawling city, which you need to now build around transit. Okay. So it's an idea which comes entirely from there. The whole philosophy of how parking policy should be designed comes from essentially one professor in University of Los Angeles, right? Somebody called Donald Shook, who has written a book called High Cost of Free Parking. So a lot of those ideas come from outside, but it makes complete sense to adapt them in Indian context. You may not have the same planning components which you might have in TOD planning in US or in North American context. When we talk about it in Indian context, we have to adapt it. But it's a very powerful example of an idea which was not born in India at all, and which I think we should definitely adopt in India, in developing countries, in Dar es Salaam, in Addis Ababa, everywhere. Why not?
Would you like to give your speech that you have prepared? So if people have questions about that, they can hop on and ask those.
Right. So I hope that I did not completely hog your debate and question and answer. But, well, I think the question regarding urbanization is a bit difficult one. And I tell you that, when we talk about urbanization in Indian context, we have to understand our history. And the history is that we live in a post-colonial society. And for that matter, many other developing countries, where for about 100 years, when Europe was going through industrial revolution and it was going through urbanization in 19th century, that did not arrive in India and Africa, in Southeast Asia for about 100 years. Because we were seen as a colonies which will produce raw material, which will be used by factories in Europe, and then which will be come back and sold to us. So for a very long period of time, we were not urbanized. So when India got its independence in 1947, it was only 17% urbanized. And if you go around doing a similar survey in Africa, in Southeast Asia, elsewhere you find that most of the Southeast Asia gets independence from colonial powers in between 1950s to 1960, and most of Africa gets its independence between 1960 to 1970. And all those while, you will see similar numbers of 15% urbanization, 20% urbanization in many of those contexts. So when it's not only urbanization, they were not allowed to industrialize. So when they move in the economic structure from being an agricultural economy, rent-fed agricultural economy, they start building their irrigation system. Then they start setting up industries. And with industries comes urbanization. They've already missed the bus of urbanization by 100 years. And we have a tendency of glorifying villages in our country. I think it's everywhere. We have a nostalgia for a rural life. It's also there in UK that everybody wants to sit in a nice garden and sip a cup of tea under the sun, right? And a very quiet rural life is something that we desire. But at the same time, we have to understand that cities also, which have been vilified on many cultural counts, have provided space for innovation and also provided space for prosperity in extremely impoverished nation, right? So, and that's why I have to remember somebody called Dr. Ambedkar, who was a scholar and a social reformer, and also one of the architect of the Indian Constitution, said that well, the village republic and the idea of village republic is based on exploitation, right? And this is happening in India. So just to give you a bit of a context, you have Mr. Gandhi, who always talked about self-sustaining village republic, whereas Ambedkar says that, well, no, villages are sites of backwardness and exploitation. And I would urge all the people who are lower caste, lower class in the villages to go in the city, because city will give you an idea of anonymity. You will be able to disperse yourself in the crowd, and you have better access to opportunity, which you will not have in a village. And that's why it's important that we look at the whole urbanization debate also from the perspective of there are people who are waiting to come from villages to the city for better life. Okay, and Europe has seen that in the whole of 19th century. You look at the education literacy level of women in early 19th century in Europe versus late 19th century in cities in Europe, you find a marked contrast, right? So female literacy rate, you won't believe that it is still a very important indicator of urbanization, right? So when India got independence, it was 17% urban, 15% was the literacy rate. Almost 99% of women in India in 1947 were illiterate. Okay, from then to come here, I think cities have played a very, very important role in that, giving access to opportunities to people. And we won't wish for a lot of people who are in an exploitative conditions in a village setup to exercise their right to the city, right? And so of course, there are concerns of sustainability and climate change, etc. But unless we see this powerful force that the city brings with it, of agglomeration economies and innovations and prosperity, we won't be able to understand the larger sustainability debate. So that's why I would like to go back to Ivan Illich's essay. It's called Energy and Equity. I would request all of you to read it if you have time. He says that, well, mechanization, modernization has definitely an energy consumption lead to social progress till a particular kind of threshold. And then beyond that threshold, it is going to become detrimental to human life. So we have to understand that different cities, different countries have not reached that threshold. So it is possible that elites in India are living high consumption lifestyle like an average middle income European family. But there are still many people in India who are living with one light bulb in their house. And they are going to buy a laptop and they are going to come to the city, look for a job, and probably first time in their entire family, somebody will buy a car, which is going to be a big thing for them. That process will take place over next 30, 40 years. So we have to allow for that to happen. At the same time, when you buy a car, there should be better public transport available to you, so that you don't really have to use it as much. And it should not become your only mode. We have to make cities like Delhi and other places safe for women, so that only way in which a woman survives in Delhi is by driving a car should not become a norm. Right? So these are the larger socio-political trends within which we have to see urbanization. And that's why if our urbanization debate is informed by this kind of facts, then we'll really be able to make it an enriching debate. Yeah, so I hope this makes sense to you. And if there are any last minute comments or questions.
I would love to thank you, Dr. Rutul Joshi. You have been an amazing panelist to our debate, and you've added so much knowledge into our idea of what urbanization is, and you've added practicality to our ideas that we have as students, as well as you've given us things to think about and to read. So we are well adapted for the future and what it holds for us in terms of urbanization. So thank you so much, and hope you have a lovely day. And
right. Thank you, Nigda, and thank you, everybody. It's been wonderful. Many years back, I had come to Cardiff University to talk to the students, so it sort of reminded me of the whole experience. I wish we could meet offline and not online, but well, that's the world we live in. So thank you very much. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.